Hey guys, find yourselves a comfortable spot and let the glow of the fireplace, or perhaps just your screen, cast a gentle light. Tonight we aren't talking about princes or princesses, dragons or swords. We're going to talk about the people who actually made the castle run. When we close our eyes and imagine a European castle, the soaring spires, the walls as thick as a loaf of bread, the great hall adorned with deer heads, we often fall for the myth that life inside was a Disney movie. We picture everyone in silk, smelling of rosewater, playing the lute, and uttering elegant nonsense like, "Oh, dear Viscount, you look exceptionally handsome today." Wrong. That image is utterly misleading. Those glittering nobles were simply the most expensive decorations the castle possessed. Without the underlying army of shadow workers, they wouldn't be able to locate their own clothes, much less enjoy a hot, perfectly roasted goose. The life of a servant is the behind-the-scenes reality of castle history, a chronicle of frantic effort and genuine hardship. They were the castle's internal engine, and that engine had to operate so quietly that not even a grease-stealing mouse could hear it. Picture this, your lord, a 200-pound man with a temper stormier than the North Sea, plans to wake at 10 a.m., hunt deer at 3 p.m., and consume an entire sheep starting at 8 p.m. And you have to be awake and moving by 4 a.m. Why? Because before your noble adult is disturbed by the first ray of sun, or rather, before his heavy velvet curtains are even pulled back, you must complete the following heroic feats. Fire up every single stone-cold room. You must work like a speedy arsonist, igniting dozens of fireplaces across the castle, all while avoiding being smoked into a crisp piece of bacon yourself. Prepare the good morning bath water. This was no small feat in the pre-plumbing era. You needed to haul dozens of buckets of icy water up 3 flights of stairs, pour them into a massive wooden tub, add hot water, and ensure the temperature was not too hot, not too cold, but just right to awaken the Lord's noble skin. Difficulty level, 5 stars. The nobles resided where the light was brightest. The servants, they were forced to live next to the blazing, smoky kitchens, near the mold-infested cellars, or crammed under the roof in tiny, drafty spaces that might as well have been designated the luxury rat suite. Servants, especially the personal valets and ladies' maids, were truly the castle's best source of gossip. They knew which mistress was sneaking champagne, which young lord couldn't actually ride a horse, and what terrible curses the master muttered about his debt in the study last night. They were the silent listeners, the underground information network. They had to act like living statues, watching their masters make a mess of their lives with an impassive face, and then quietly, secretly, clean up the disaster. Serving the nobility, therefore, was far from glamorous. It was essentially a trade your freedom for survival lifetime contract. You sacrificed your right to sleep in and your control over your own life. But you secured a crucial guarantee. When famine hit, you wouldn't starve outside the castle walls. This stability was the costly reward for endless toil and complete invisibility. As you prepare for the next chapter, remember the scullery maid carrying a heavy bucket through a dark corridor at 3:30 a.m. She is not the main character, but she is the true unsung hero. All right, guys, last time we covered the sheer exhaustion of living in the shadows. Now, let's pull back the curtain and see how this miniature society was organized. If you imagine servants as just a bunch of people in drab clothes holding brooms, you are deeply mistaken. The servant system in a castle was more complex and status-driven than your high school cliques. This wasn't just a job. This was a living, breathing social pyramid. Imagine walking into a bustling castle. The first thing you'd notice is that even the lowest maid bows deeper to a man wearing a little badge than she does to anyone else. That's status. In a castle, the closer you were to the master's bedroom, the higher you're standing, the closer you were to the kitchen fire, the lower you're standing. The peak of the pyramid, power elite, and the inner circle. At the very top stood those granted the scepter of authority, who barely did any manual labor, but held more power than a minor baron. The steward, majordomo. Pay attention. This man was the shadow lord of the castle. While the lord handled diplomacy and warfare, the steward handled the money. He managed the estate's income, the servants' payroll, and all procurement. He was often the only person authorized to say, "My lord, your spending this month has been quite excessive." His office was usually larger than a common servant's entire home, and he himself was the very definition of respectability. The housekeeper, the mistress of the housekeeping. If the steward managed money and men, the housekeeper managed all women and all fabric. She scheduled the maids, inventoried the linens, which, back then, were often more valuable than gold, and oversaw the care of tableware and furniture. She was like a seasoned owl, whose eyes could penetrate every thread of the tapestry. If she found one smudge, the entire female staff was in trouble. Second, middle management, the specialists with small privileges. This layer was made up of skilled professionals who enjoyed a decent life, but were still very much subject to the master's moods. The valet, personal attendant. This was possibly the strangest job in the servant world. Their duties included assisting the lord with dressing, shaving, and even handling confidential correspondence. They were the only ones who saw the lord's true, out-of-armor, self. They often wore the lord's discarded clothes, which immediately elevated them above the other servants. They had to possess absolute loyalty and a first-rate mouth, know every secret, but never utter a single word. The head cook, the food in the castle was a symbol of status. The head cook presided over his own kingdom, the kitchen. This kingdom was full of fire, steam, and terror. The cook's temper was usually hotter than the fat in his frying pan, because messing up a state dinner was far worse than a kitchen boy breaking a dish. He had the right to yell at anyone in the kitchen. His authority came from the massive meat cleaver in his hand. The lady's maid, the personal assistant to the mistress. They were responsible for hair, dressing, and handling the mistress's cosmetics and jewelry. They served as the lady's emotional garbage bin, listening to every complaint, sigh, and whispered insult about the lord. Like the valet, they knew too much and had to be exceptionally discreet. The third. The base of the pyramid, labor and sweat. This layer was the foundation of the castle, the core of physical labor, the silent majority, scullery maids, findy kitchen boys. This was less a job and more a punishment. They were responsible for cleaning mountains of greasy dishes, scrubbing floors, and hauling firewood. They were submerged in grease and steam from dawn till dusk, doing the hardest, dirtiest, and hottest work in the castle. They were usually young or from the lowest social strata, focusing on one thing, getting fed. Footmen to and grooms responsible for heavy lifting, running messages, and tending to the horses. They had to be tall, strong, and fast. During large banquets, they stood like statues behind the masters, holding platters and shooing away flies. In short, in the castle's micro-society, you didn't live for a job. You lived for a title. Your name was followed by your function, and your function dictated your place at the table. If you were lucky enough to get one, the size of your bunk, and even which staircase you were allowed to use. Next up, we will sneak into the most secretive and busy places, the steward's office and the housekeeper's kingdom, to see how these power brokers ruled the entire staff. All right, guys, we are now entering the most fascinating and, frankly, most terrifying areas of the castle. Last chapter, we learned that at the apex of the servant pyramid sat two heavy hitters, the steward, majordomo, and the housekeeper. They didn't personally fetch platters or scrub floors, but the authority they wielded could make any servant in the castle tremble. They were the castle's shadow CEOs, the director and financial controller behind the grand play of aristocratic life. The steward's cash power and political acumen. The steward was usually a man of calm demeanor, impeccably dressed, always clutching a thick ledger. Unlike the lord, who spent his time hunting or feuding with neighbors, the steward cared about only one thing: the numbers. The steward's job, simply put, was to ensure that the castle's financial black hole did not swallow the noble family whole. Chief Financial Officer and Procurement King, his daily routine was like an epic math exam. He calculated the harvest yield, the tenant farmers' rents, and the food consumed by the hundreds of mouths in the castle. He was in charge of all procurement, from the finest Bordeaux wine to the black bread fed to the kitchen boys. He was essentially a CEO working in a giant supermarket. Only the inventory was a full year's supply of food and fuel. The servant judge, while the lord technically held the power of dismissal. The steward was practically the master of life and death for the staff. He handled recruitment, firing, salary negotiation, and even settling petty servant squabbles. like two kitchen boys fighting over a scrubbing brush, or two maids giving each other the silent treatment over a footman. He had to be fair, but, more importantly, strict, because if the staff became disorganized, the Lord would hold him responsible. The Lord's emotional stabilizer. The Lord often had sudden whims. I shall host a 500-person feast in 3 days. When everyone panicked, only the steward could maintain a polite smile while using a complex series of gestures to tell his subordinates, "Move. In 3 days. There must be 500 roasted squabs." He was responsible for translating the Lord's various aristocratic insanities into actionable plans. The housekeeper's fabric empire and secret surveillance. If the steward was the diplomat of finance, the housekeeper was the autocratic queen of the home. Her center of power was usually the linen room, a place smelling of lavender, but nonetheless oppressive. The guardian of linen. In that era, textiles were incredibly expensive. A high-quality linen tablecloth could be worth several cows. The housekeeper's job was to ensure that every tablecloth, every towel, and every sheet was accounted for and never missing. She spent her days counting, inspecting, and mending. If a single piece of linen went missing, it was, in her eyes, a bigger crisis than the exposure of the Lord's illegitimate child. The high court for maids, all female staff from the lady's maid to the scullery maid, answered to the housekeeper. She was responsible for their training, discipline, and morals. She acted like a strict mother superior, tolerating zero laziness, zero flirtation, or any improper conduct. She possessed omnipresent eyes. She knew which maid was secretly hoarding candles, and which one snuck off to the wine cellar at night. Her deterrent power was more effective than the castle guards. Maintaining the illusion of perfection, the housekeeper ensured that the nobles lived in a state of perpetual, effortless perfection. While the nobles were laughing in the great hall, it was the housekeeper who ensured the fires were always burning just right, that there were no strange odors in the air, and not a single hair on the carpet. Her job was to make everything appear seamless, as if the castle cleaned itself and the food cooked itself. The relationship between the steward and the housekeeper was often a delicate dance of power. They cooperated to maintain the castle's operation, but were constantly wary of each other, knowing the other possessed the resources and information to challenge their status. It was these two invisible figures who, with their sharp minds and iron fists, organized hundreds of servants into one efficient machine, ensuring the nobles could comfortably enjoy their privileges. Next, we will climb to the second tier of the pyramid to meet those closest to the aristocratic core, the valets and ladies' maids, and see how they navigated the treacherous intimacy of their masters' private lives. Dear guys, if you thought the steward and the housekeeper had tough jobs, at least their stress came from manageable realms like finance and discipline. The people we are discussing tonight, however, faced pressure directly from the most unpredictable source of all, the master's mood and the master's body. Welcome to the second tier of the servant pyramid, the valet and the lady's maid. They were the elite among the staff, yet they were also the most dangerous listeners. The valet, the living mirror, and the moving wardrobe. The valet's job was far more complex than just tying the Lord's shoelaces. They were the architects of the Lord's public image and the custodians of his secrets. Imagine the Lord's chamber at 7:30 a.m. The Lord is awake, grumpy, and perhaps suffering from a severe case of bad breath. Since toothbrushes were not yet commonplace, the valet had to snap to attention like a highly trained soldier. The dressing ritual and the philosophy of the garment. Dressing was a complex ritual back then. The valet was responsible for layering 20 pounds of silk, velvet, and lace onto the Lord, ensuring every fold was perfect. But the hardest part was shaving. Operating a sharp blade near a grumpy, hung-over Lord's face required more than just steady hands. It required ironclad nerves. The valet had to disappear completely during this task, showing no judgment in his eyes, acting merely as a breathing tool. The contradiction of status, one of the valet's chief privileges, was wearing the Lord's discarded clothing. This made them look magnificent to the other servants. Some might even mistake them for minor, impoverished nobles. They often had the opportunity to learn reading and writing, handling the Lord's private correspondence. This endowed them with a contradictory status. Physically a servant, but mentally and externally a pseudo-noble. The secret collector. They knew all the master's most private details, where his love letters were hidden, where he stashed his secret funds, and his unmentionable minor physical ailments. They were the Lord's most trusted man, and also his most dangerous time bomb. One drunken slip of the tongue, one indiscreet look, could send them plummeting from the second tier of the pyramid straight into hell. It. The lady's maid, the emotional sponge, and the beauty expert. If the valet managed the Lord's public image, the lady's maid managed the mistress's private reality. The lady's life was built upon vanity and complicated social protocol, and the maid was the guardian of this system. War at the dressing table. The lady's maid had to be a top-tier beauty expert of the time. They spent hours constructing intricate hairstyles, architectural wonders built from wax, oil, and false hairpieces. They also dealt with the deadly cosmetics, lead-based powder that whitened the skin but slowly poisoned the body. The maid was the only person who knew the lady's true age, her true hair volume, and the actual condition of her skin. The emotional buffer. The maid served as the lady's emotional garbage bin. She had to listen to the lady's complaints about the Lord, her jealousy of social rivals, and her sighs over her own unhappy fate. Her job demanded that she reflect the mistress's emotions like a mirror, yet never have any emotions of her own. The underground informant. The maid's quarters were the information hub for all female staff in the castle. The upper-tier gossip she heard from the lady would be funneled through her to the housekeeper, and then spread throughout the servant network. They knew which guest's jewelry was fake, and which lady had a secret rendezvous in the garden last night. The rule of treading on thin ice for both the valet and the lady's maid. Their survival rule was intimate proximity, vast emotional distance. They were the wealthiest and most respectable among the servants, receiving the highest wages, plus frequent tips and gifts from the nobles. However, their psychological pressure was the most intense. They had to be both a shadow and a statue. A shadow doesn't speak, and a statue doesn't feel. If they ever crossed the line, say by offering an unsolicited opinion or accidentally witnessing something they shouldn't, their career could end instantly. They were dancers on a tightrope, with the solid structure of the servant pyramid beneath their feet, and the fickle nature of the aristocratic world dangling above their heads. Next, we shall leave these rooms full of silk and secrets and descend into the castle's very heart, the kitchen. It is a realm of heat, chaos, and a tyrannical head cook. Dear guys, please take a deep breath and imagine the smell. Intense animal fat, the scorch of roasted meat, mountains of rotting food scraps, and the most inescapable scent of all, sweat. Welcome to the castle's heart, soul, and hell, the kitchen. If the Lord's bedroom was a calm lake, the kitchen was a volcano, ready to erupt at any moment. This was the loudest, hottest, and most dangerous place in the castle, and it was the eternal purgatory for the core of the servant pyramid's base, the scullery maids and kitchen boys. The kitchen, a never-ending volcano in the days before ventilation fans. A large castle kitchen was a steam bath and barbecue pit combined, operating non-stop. Imagine massive fireplaces crackling with wood, the fire reaching hundreds of degrees, the air thick with smoke from burning fat, making your eyes water as if you'd been peeling a ton of onions, the floor perpetually slick and greasy from spilled water and oil. The temperature here, even in the coldest winter, was enough to drench a person in sweat within minutes. Servants often joked that there were two places to stay warm in the castle, in front of the master's fireplace, and in the core of the kitchen, but the latter came at the price of enduring extreme heat and the cook's wrath. The head cook, the kitchen tyrant. The head cook, a core figure in our middle management tier, wielded a power that was much more direct and far more volatile than the steward's authority over the general staff. In a castle, food was not just sustenance, it was a display of power and status. If a banquet failed, the Lord's reputation was ruined. Consequently, the head cook operated under immense pressure, which granted him the privilege of issuing commands and even throwing objects. Absolute ruler, the cook's control over the kitchen was absolute. His word was law, often superseding the housekeeper's authority within his domain. He typically employed a unique language consisting of various curses, shouts, and the clanging of metal professional paranoia. He had to be an artist, a chemist, and a military strategist. He meticulously managed the seasonality of ingredients, the timing of cooking, and how to use dozens of spices to mask any less than fresh meat. His greatest fear wasn't being fired, but poisoning the nobility. Should that happen, he might be sent straight to the dungeon. Suppression of staff, the cook's attitude towards his lowest level staff. The kitchen boys and scullery maids was often rougher than his treatment of the meat on the chopping block. These helpers were his scapegoats and his source of physical labor. If the main course was scorched, the cook would often kick the nearest kitchen boy to ensure responsibility had been assigned. I'd heard the hardship below. Scullery maids and turnspit boys, the lowest tier of the kitchen staff, was the true greasy foundation. They were the most exhausted, dirtiest, but often the most robust people in the pyramid. Scullery maids, this was one of the most undesirable jobs in the servant system. Their task was to stand before mountains of wooden dishes and metal pots, endlessly cleaning them with cold water, sand, and wood ash. The cleaning agents of the day. Their hands were constantly soaked in grease and frigid water, leading to rough skin and inflamed joints. Their quarters were usually near the kitchen, smelly, but with one small perk: proximity to the heat. Turnspit boys, this was an extremely arduous and dangerous job. Their role was to crank a heavy roasting spit for hours on end to ensure the meat was cooked evenly. They had to stand right next to the scorching fire, enduring intense heat waves. In some periods, specially trained turnspit dogs were used for this chore. But even then, a boy was needed to supervise and swap the dogs out. The turnspit boy was often blackened by smoke, his clothes riddled with holes burned by flying embers. Eve. The small joys of the basement, despite the hellish nature of the kitchen, it offered the lower-tier servants. A few small joys, not available elsewhere. Food. There was always food in the kitchen. While the servants' official rations were coarse black bread, gruel, and cheap meat, the kitchen staff could always find some acceptable leftovers, trimmings, or even delicacies, secretly intercepted from the noble's table. In the face of hunger, this was paradise. Warmth in the cold, stone castle. The kitchen was one of the few places that was consistently warm. For servants sleeping in drafty quarters, working in the kitchen at least ensured they wouldn't freeze. The kitchen was a volcano of contradictions, a paradise for creating gourmet food and a hell for manual labor. The head cook's kingdom, and the place where his helpers traded sweat for survival. Next, we will step outside the castle walls to meet the perimeter guardians, the grooms and hunters, and see how their lives were intertwined with the vast estate. Dear guys, if you're tired of the smoky kitchens and the secret-filled bedrooms, now imagine the smell of fresh earth, horse sweat, and the crisp air of wet grass. We are stepping outside the main castle structure into the perimeter service area. The servants here stood in stark contrast to the indoor staff. They enjoyed more physical labor, less direct noble scrutiny. The lord couldn't watch the stables 24/7, and more opportunities for external contact. They were the castle's outdoor sports team. Grooms in the stables, the furry aristocrats in that era. The importance of horses was equivalent to today's luxury sports cars and private jets. The stable was the castle's transportation hub, and the groom was the absolute authority there. Horses over servants, the groom's life revolved around those furry nobles. The value of a war horse or a prized hunting mount was often higher than the combined worth of 10 kitchen boys. If a horse fell ill, it caused more panic than the lord catching a mild cold. Grooms had to be experts on horse temperaments, diets, and health. Their attention to the horses often surpassed their concern for their fellow servants. Hierarchy in the manure. Even the stables had a strict hierarchy. The head groom wielded significant power, overseeing horse training, purchasing tack, and supervising other grooms. At the bottom were the stable boys, whose job was to shovel manure, haul feed, and endure the rough tempers of the senior grooms. The stable boy was the servant easiest to smell out in the castle, as they were permanently scented with the strong aroma of horse manure. A hint of freedom, because grooms often needed to ride out on errands, like delivering messages, collecting goods, or accompanying hunting parties. They possessed a geographical freedom. They had more exposure to the outside world and more information than those trapped in the kitchens and laundries. This freedom was highly coveted by many lower-tier servants. Hunters and foresters, the elite masters of the wild hunting, was the ultimate ritual for nobles to display their power and bravery. The hunter-forester was the unsung hero of this ceremony. The Lord's wilderness tutor, the hunter had to know every inch of the estate and every animal trail like the back of his hand. They were expert trackers and archers. Their status was higher than that of common servants, because their skills were irreplaceable. The Lord needed them to ensure he actually hit the prey, thereby maintaining his image of valor. Special perks. Hunters often enjoyed special treatment. They might live in a small cottage on the estate, rather than being crammed into the castle dormitories. They were permitted to eat the fresh meat they hunted, which was a vast improvement over the salted fare in the servants' rations. Danger and risk, of course. Their job was fraught with risks. Being attacked by wild boars, getting lost in the forest, or more commonly, being made the scapegoat because the Lord missed his shot. Third, gardeners in the land, the guardians of castle. Beauty the gardener was perhaps the most zen of the perimeter staff. Their work was concerned with beauty, order, and life. From utility to beauty, early castle gardeners primarily focused on cultivating herbs and vegetables, ensuring the castle's food supply and basic medicinal needs. As the era progressed, their focus shifted to designing and maintaining ornamental gardens. The intricate mazes, perfectly clipped hedges, and colorful flower beds. Calmness and patience. The gardener's work required immense patience. They didn't have to face the cook's yelling or the housekeeper's cold stares. Their boss was the weather and the soil. This close interaction with nature lent their psychological life a relative calmness. The alternative food source. Gardeners were usually experts at secretly stashing fruits and vegetables in the castle. They always found a way to lose an apple or a basket of berries during inventory checks for themselves or their favorite colleagues. The perimeter guardians, with their physical strength, skills, and understanding of nature, supported the castle's external image and self-sufficiency. They were the group least subject to the nobles' close scrutiny, and this physical distance afforded them a valuable breath of free air. Next, we will return indoors to focus on one of the servants' core duties, the art of the dinner table, to see how a grand noble banquet required the staff to perform a perfectly timed, dramatic act. Dear guys, if you assume noble dining was a casual affair, you are mistaken. For the aristocracy, the dinner table was their theater, and the servants were the indispensable props and actors in this drama. Now, let's push open the heavy doors of the Great Hall and observe the millisecond, precise, art of the table performed by the servants behind the scenes of a grand banquet. Pre-meal preparation from scouring to staging before the guests arrived. The Great Hall had to be rapidly transformed from a common living space into a sparkling, imposing stage. The cutlery catwalk, in the pre-dishwasher era, cleaning and polishing the tableware, was a Herculean task. Servants had to use fine sand and vinegar to scrub all the silver, gold, and crystal glasses until they were bright enough to reflect the noble's distorted face. If a single fingerprint or a dull silver spoon was found, the responsible servant would face an hour-long moral interrogation from the housekeeper. The tablecloth engineering, laying the tablecloth itself, was an art. The massive linen cloth had to hang perfectly, without a single wrinkle. This usually required several servants working in perfect synchronization, like unfolding a giant map. If the corners of the cloth weren't aligned, the entire banquet was deemed ruined. The politics of seating servants, particularly the steward and the head footman, had to be intimately familiar with the noble world's complex hierarchy. Who sat next to the lord? Who should face the fireplace? Which sworn enemies couldn't be seated together? A mistaken seating arrangement could trigger a minor diplomatic crisis, and the servant would take the blame the second. The philosophy of service, footmen as statues, and precise choreography when the nobles were seated. The servant's job shifted from staging to performance. The footman's statue training. The head footman rigorously trained his staff. Footmen had to be tall, immaculately dressed, and their job was to stand behind their masters, motionless like statues. They were instructed, you are part of the background, you shouldn't be seen, and you shouldn't be heard. Being noticed by the master usually meant you had done something wrong. The dish parade, serving the food, was never casual. The order of dishes, their presentation, and the servants' choreography were strictly regulated. Servants had to serve from the left and clear from the right. all while maintaining absolute silence. If a servant stumbled or accidentally let cutlery clank, it was deemed a catastrophe. The silent informants, the servants' position at the table, afforded them the opportunity for ultra-close eavesdropping. They heard the political secrets, business deals, and even vows of infidelity spoken by the nobles when their vigilance was lowered by wine. They had to digest this information and decide whether to keep it secret or subtly report it to the steward. For future internal control, the table challenges, speed, theft, and leftovers noble dining often lasted for hours, a double test of the servant's physical and mental endurance. The art of rapid withdrawal during multi-course banquets. Servants had to act like well-trained operatives, clearing dozens of used place settings and replacing them with clean, appropriate cutlery for the next course, all in the shortest time possible. The entire process had to be executed seamlessly while the nobles were mid-conversation. The temptation and risk of theft, faced with delicious roasts and delicate desserts. The hungry servants faced immense temptation. Sneaking away a piece of bread or a small bite of meat was common. But if caught, the consequence was often worse than mere dismissal. Thus, they had to learn to eat the food with their eyes. The servants' feast. Once the nobles were finished, the leftovers on the table became the servants' great meal. Higher-ranking servants, like footmen and valets, got the best scraps, while the lower-tier staff, like kitchen boys, got the coarser trimmings. This distribution of scraps formed another hierarchy within the servant staff itself. In summary, the nobles displayed their wealth and manners at the dining table, while the servants displayed their professionalism, discipline, and endurance. This grand performance demanded perfection, and that perfection came at the cost of the servant's silence and labor. Next, we will discuss another core servant duty, the philosophy of the wardrobe, to see how those expensive silks, laces, and uniforms were maintained and protected. Dear listeners, if you are currently nestled in a clean, warm bed, enjoying the convenience of running water and a sewage system, please be grateful for modern civilization, because the chapter we are about to enter concerns the most unsettling and deadly aspect of castle life: the daily struggle with the lack of sanitation. How did a castle housing hundreds of people manage without flush toilets and effective drainage? The answer: it barely managed and often failed. The castle smell. A giant microbe. Farm nobles wore perfumed clothing, but the castles they inhabited were often permeated by a pervasive, hard-to-mask stench of decay. The primitive waste system. Nobles used chamber pots, which were handled by low-ranking servants, like the groom of the stool. The waste was typically disposed of simply by dumping it into the moat or a ditch beneath the outer walls. Servants, meanwhile, might use a communal wooden bucket, periodically emptied by dedicated staff. The accumulation of trash. The kitchen produced vast amounts of food scraps, bones, and grease. Bedrooms produced soiled bedding. The laundry room emitted foul wastewater. This refuse was usually just piled up in a corner of the castle or thrown outside the walls, attracting swarms of flies, rats, and wild animals. The floor threat. Castle floors were made of stone or earth and rarely thoroughly sterilized. Food debris, animal waste, and human waste mixed together, making the castle a massive breeding ground for bacteria. Parasites and the walking flea bag in an era when bathing was often considered detrimental to health. Yes, you heard that right. Nobles believed frequent washing caused illness. Parasites were a constant nuisance for everyone, but for servants, they were companions for life. The symbiotic fleas, lice, and bed bugs were ubiquitous in the castle. Servants' quarters were cramped, and bedding often consisted of straw mattresses or coarse wool, which was impossible to clean thoroughly. Servants had to learn to tolerate the itchiness, often using a small stick to pick lice, a common form of evening entertainment. The rat army, due to rudimentary food storage conditions. Rats formed a large army within the castle. They not only stole food, but, more terrifyingly, were the carriers of deadly diseases like the Black Death. Plague servants' dormitories were often the easiest places for rats to invade. Disease, the servant's invisible killer under such harsh sanitary conditions. The servant class had very low resistance to disease, resulting in extremely high mortality rates. Common occupational hazards. The high heat and smoke in the kitchen led to respiratory illnesses. The cold water and lie in the laundry room caused rheumatism and skin diseases. Heavy manual labor resulted in joint and spinal injuries. Rudimentary medical care, a physician or apothecary was usually present in the castle, but their services were primarily reserved for the nobility. If a servant fell ill, they often had to rely on folk remedies, herbs, or request a day or two off from the housekeeper. The fear of isolation. If a servant contracted a contagious disease, such as smallpox or typhus, they were typically swiftly isolated in a remote, unsupervised room, which essentially amounted to a death sentence. No one was willing to risk their life to care for a low-ranking servant. The heroes of cleanliness, laundresses, and footmen. The irony is that the servants working in the filthiest conditions bore the responsibility for maintaining the castle's appearance of cleanliness. The temporary sheen of the floor. Footmen had to scrub the great hall floor daily with sand, brooms, and coarse cloth to make it look clean. But this cleaning was superficial. As soon as the nobles left, the underlying filth would reappear. The placebo of disinfection. To combat the stench, servants would burn large quantities of spices and herbs, attempting to mask the odor of decay with intense perfumes. This served as a psychological placebo, making the nobles feel that everything was clean. The health and lifespan of the servants were the heaviest price paid for aristocratic luxury. Their lives were short and often plagued by suffering, ending quietly from a minor infection or contagious disease, only to be swiftly replaced by new, healthy servants who continued to support this magnificent yet unhygienic stone castle. Next, we will discuss another central focus of the kitchen, the war over food, from procurement to allocation, and how food was a symbol of power, status, and survival in the castle. Dear listeners, we are back in the kitchen, but this time we are not talking about heat and steam. We are discussing something far more critical: what to eat, who gets to eat it, and how to make sure there is enough to go around. In a castle, food was not a given. It required complex logistics, rigorous budgetary control, and relentless internal interception. The flow of food perfectly illustrated every tier of the servant pyramid. The source of food. The steward's frugality food supply was the most expensive and demanding item in the castle budget, and the main man in charge was still our steward. Slave to the seasons, in an era without refrigeration or efficient transport, the steward had to be a slave to the seasons and the harvest. He had to plan a full year's worth of food reserves, curing vast amounts of meat, brewing enormous quantities of beer and wine, and drying grain. If the harvest was poor, he would have to squeeze the tenants harder or buy expensive alternatives from the market. The slaughter on the ledger. The steward's ledger tracked every morsel of food. He had to be shrewd, ensuring the noble table had foie gras, spices, and fine wine, while simultaneously ensuring the servants' rations kept them alive and working, but not too plump. Any budget overrun was seen by the lord as a betrayal of the family fortune. The art of preservation. Servants spent a huge amount of time combating spoilage. Meats had to be heavily salted, and vegetables pickled or dried. Even so, spoilage was common. The cooks became the masters of the art of corruption, skilled at using spices, sauces, and alcohol to hide the slight rancidity of meat. The art of allocation. Hierarchy in the servants' mess. Nobles ate cuisine, and servants ate fuel. The servants' meal allowance directly reflected their place in the pyramid. The upper-tier privilege. Servants like the steward, housekeeper, valets, and ladies' maids usually dined in a separate servants' hall, enjoying second-tier food. While not as refined as the noble's table, it was generally hot, fresh, and included a certain amount of meat and white bread. They might even have a separate allowance of wine or beer. The middle-tier scramble. Footmen and gardeners might dine in a corner of the main kitchen, eating coarse black bread, gruel, and salted meat. Their meals were primarily for sustenance, with little consideration for taste. Dining time was often brief to rush back to duty. The base's edge of hunger. Kitchen boys and stable boys were at the bottom of the food allocation system. They received the cheapest grains and the poorest cuts of meat, often served cold. Their survival strategy was eating on the sly, intercepting leftovers from the kitchen, or secretly chewing on bread while working. The war under the table, theft, interception, and corruption. Despite strict discipline, the temptation of food was enormous, which led to an underground economy among the servants. The cook's gray income. The head cook's control over ingredients gave him immense gray power. He could over-report quantities to suppliers, and then secretly sell the surplus ingredients, or use them to bribe other servants who could be useful to him. This was the most common and secretive form of corruption in the castle. The accidents at the table, high-ranking footmen, while clearing dishes, often had a technique of quick hands and quick eyes, swiftly transferring high-quality cuts of meat or fruit from the noble's plate that were untouched, but too embarrassing to reserve into their pockets or hiding spots. The deterrent of punishment, the penalty for stealing food, was severe. If caught, it ranged from a public beating to branding or immediate dismissal, as food theft was considered a challenge to the entire castle order. This meant most servants, despite the temptation of hunger, had to maintain reverence. In the castle, food wasn't just for survival, it was also a social currency. A small piece of white bread, a promise of "I saved this for you," could become a bargaining chip for servants to build friendships, seek help, or even strike a secret deal. Next, we will discuss the servants' personal life, rest, and dining, and see how they carved out moments of private peace and socializing amidst their endless labor. Dear listeners, if the steward was the supreme commander of the castle's male staff, the housekeeper, mistress of the house Cimetron, was the undisputed queen of the female domain. Her authority extended over every maid, seamstress, laundress, and all the physical spaces of the castle interior. Her story is one of order, meticulousness, absolute secrecy, and the immense responsibility of managing the castle's domestic machine. The housekeeper, the lady's hand and the castle's mother. The housekeeper was generally an older, unmarried woman or a widow, whose reputation and experience were impeccable. Her power came directly from the lady of the house, and she was the highest-ranking female servant. Commander-in-chief of the interior, the housekeeper managed all domestic supplies, including linen, china, candles, soap, and cleaning tools. She was responsible for the cleanliness, decoration, and daily maintenance of every room, from the great hall to the servants' quarters. The keeper of the keys and treasure, she was the guardian of the linen room and the china-silver closet. These were critical assets of the noble family. The housekeeper held numerous keys, and the cleanliness of the inventory was directly related to her competence. She was often a target of the steward's scrutiny, as she managed a large portion of the household's material expenses. The lady's confidence. The housekeeper was often the closest female confidante of the lady. She knew the mistress's social secrets, private habits, and personal wishes. Her discretion was her greatest asset, allowing her to gain significant power and influence. The female servant pyramid, the hierarchy of cleanliness beneath the housekeeper, lay a strictly hierarchical structure of female servants, their duties ranked by proximity to the nobility and the cleanliness of their tasks. The lady's maid or personal attendant was at the top. She served the mistress directly, assisting with dressing, hair, makeup, and personal care. She often shared the mistress's room or an adjacent one, making her a crucial carrier of information and secrets. Her work was clean and intimate, granting her high status. The chambermaids were responsible for the cleanliness and tidiness of the bedrooms and reception rooms. Their work was demanding but respectable, as they were often seen by noble guests. They had to master complex tasks like making beds, polishing wood, and managing fireplaces. The scullery and laundry maids at the bottom were the scullery maids and laundresses. Their work was the dirtiest, most physically demanding, and often the most unpleasant. They dealt with greasy dishes, human waste, chamber pots, and the constant labor of washing heavy linen in cold, harsh water, which often caused skin damage. They held the lowest status among the female staff. The housekeeper's challenge, management, and discipline, managing a large group of female servants, was a significant challenge for the housekeeper, requiring not only organizational skills but also firm discipline, maintaining order and morality. The housekeeper was the ultimate authority on morality among the female staff. She had to ensure that the maids did not engage in gambling, gossip, or improper relationships with the male servants. Her primary concern was to protect the reputation of the household and its female staff. Training and oversight, she was responsible for training new maids, teaching them the complex rules of etiquette, cleaning methods, and the strict schedule. Her oversight was constant and meticulous. Any lapse in cleanliness or order was considered her personal failure. The power of assignment. The housekeeper's favor was crucial to a maid's life. She could assign a maid to an easier, cleaner task, like cleaning the great hall, or a harder, dirtier one, like washing clothes in the freezing winter. Servants often had to curry her favor to improve their working conditions. The housekeeper was the pillar of the castle's internal order. She was a manager, a disciplinarian, and a silent guardian of the noble family's secrets and domestic decorum. The female servant pyramid under her rule was a structure defined by proximity to the master and mistress, and the cleanliness of the tasks performed. Next, we will focus on the stable master, coachman, and grooms, the managers of the castle's external transport and animal care. Dear listeners, if you feel overwhelmed by phone notifications today, imagine an era with no mobile phones, no email, and even carrier pigeons were slow and unreliable. In the castle, information was power, and the servants who carried it were the fastest, most exhausted, and most often lost people around. Welcome to the world of messaging and running. These servants, particularly the footmen and pages, were the castle's walking telephones and human express couriers. The castle maze, the runner's daily challenge. A large European castle was typically a massive stone labyrinth, full of secret passages, back staircases, and countless rooms. For a runner, this was both a challenge and a nightmare. Experts at the hide and seek game. The Lord suddenly remembers he needs to send a letter from the third-floor library to the lady, who is currently receiving a guest on the second floor of the east wing. The runner had to know where everyone might be in the castle. This required a deep understanding of the master's schedule, temperament, and habits. Finding the wrong room could lead to a scolding, or worse, delaying a crucial matter. The staircase marathon. Castles often had 4 or 5 stories, with steep and slippery stairs. Runners had to ascend and descend dozens of times a day from the cellar to the tower top, and back to the stables. Their legs were their engines, and their daily life was an unending vertical marathon. The silent messenger. When delivering a message, the runner had to be in a vacuum state. They couldn't peek at the contents of letters, couldn't comment on the master's verbal message, and had to remain expressionless. If the verbal message was, "Go tell the cook that tonight's soup tastes like dishwater," the runner had to repeat the insult in the calmest tone possible, ensuring they didn't incur the cook's wrath. The underground stream of information. Aside from official letters and verbal messages, there was an informal but much faster and more efficient underground information flow among the servants. The kitchen's secret radio. Footmen would often rest near the kitchen door while waiting for instructions or after delivering a message. The nobles' chatter and breaking news they brought back from the great hall would rapidly spread among the kitchen boys, laundresses, and grooms. This network was faster than any official channel. The personal servants' filter station, valets, and ladies' maids were the filter stations of information flow. They got first-hand information from the masters, but they would only selectively leak information to the steward or housekeeper. This selective information control was crucial for maintaining their status and influence. Lies and exaggeration. Information inevitably got distorted in transmission. A piece of news about the Lord having too much wine might become, "The Lord ran naked through the great hall last night." By the time it reached the stables, servants relied on this exaggerated gossip to relieve boredom and stress. They teamed. Outside the castle, the runner's world, some errands required leaving the castle, venturing into the town, the marketplace, or neighboring estates. For the servants, this was the temptation of freedom, a brief respite. Leaving the castle meant a brief chance to breathe unsupervised air. They could stop for a drink at a tavern, chat with friends in town, or simply experience life without the pressure of the hierarchy. The risk of the message, carrying important documents or packages, was extremely dangerous. If a letter was stolen or a package lost, the runner faced severe punishment. They had to learn how to protect their cargo, sometimes even facing threats from bandits. Dual identity: a runner in town might dress like a minor gentleman, thanks to the lord's cast-off clothes. But inside the castle, they were still just a servant taking orders. This dual identity made them yearn for the freedom of the outside world, yet dependent on the stability inside the castle. The work of messengers and runners was the lubricant that kept the castle running daily. They connected every room with their feet and gathered every secret of the noble world with their ears. Their hard work ensured the nobles received the information and service they desired, whenever and wherever they wanted it. Next, we will discuss another group full of potential and pressure: pages and child labor. The reserve force of the castle servant class. Dear listeners, the vast machine of the castle required a constant influx of fresh blood. This fresh blood usually came in the form of children aged 10 to 15, who were sent to the castle to begin their apprenticeship. Their stories are filled with hardship, rigorous training, and a faint glimmer of hope for promotion. Welcome to the era of child labor in the castle. The origin and purpose of child labor. Why did castles employ so many children? The reasons were simple: cheap, easily molded, and sufficiently energetic. Parental hopes. Many poor families sent their children to the castle not for luxury, but to ensure their survival. In the castle, a child would at least be fed, clothed, and taught a trade. If the child excelled, they could become a respectable senior servant, thereby improving the entire family's fortune. The apprenticeship system. The castle viewed child laborers as living investments. They started with the lowest jobs: washing dishes, sweeping floors, and running errands. Older servants would teach them skills, but the price was that these children had to perform the dirtiest, hardest, and most despised manual labor. Destiny division. A child's fate was often determined early on. Boys with talent and good looks might become a page, serving the nobility. Most children were thrown directly into the kitchen. Kitchen boy, or the stables, stable boy. The page, the noble's shadow apprentice. The page was the elite among child laborers, the mobile helper, by the noble's side, often a candidate for a future valet or senior footman. Elite education. Pages received basic education, learning etiquette, reading, writing, and sometimes a bit of fencing or riding. They shadowed their master, learning how to act and speak like a noble. High risk exposure. The page's job was outwardly glamorous, but carried high risk. Any minor mistake they made, spilling a cup or acting awkwardly in front of guests, was an embarrassment to the master. The punishment was often corporal, severe, and immediate. Future hope. If a page was promoted to valet or secretary upon reaching adulthood, their future was bright. But if they performed poorly, they might be demoted to a common footman. Stable boys and kitchen boys. A childhood of sweat and grease for most child laborers. Their childhood was defined by sweat, fire, and manure. The hardship of the stable boy. Stable boys were the lowest rung of the stable hierarchy, responsible for clearing manure and hauling feed. They were perpetually scented with the smell of manure, giving them very low social status within the castle. Their work was brutally hard, but at least in the stables, they learned animal husbandry skills, offering a path to becoming a senior groom later in life. The torture of the kitchen boy. Kitchen boys faced endless washing, floor scrubbing, and the scorching heat of the furnace. The head cook showed them no mercy, often using a wooden spoon or harsh language for punishment. Their task was to ensure the kitchen machine kept running, even if it meant working for over 12 hours straight. The cruel promotion ladder promotion within the servant class was pyramidal. The higher you went, the harder it became. Internal competition. There was fierce competition among the child laborers in the castle. Every open position, like a vacant footman spot, drew dozens of eager eyes. They had to be not only hard-working but also skilled at choosing sides, earning the favor of the steward, the housekeeper, or the head cook. Stamina and endurance. Castle work was not designed for the weak. Many child laborers dropped out due to illness, injury, or simply succumbing to the physical strain. The children who persevered into adulthood possessed iron wills and strong constitutions. Success stories. The rare success stories. A kitchen boy becoming the cook's deputy, or a page becoming the lord's private secretary. were treated by the servants as beacons of hope, encouraging others to continue their journey in the dark. These children, with their tender shoulders, supported the daily needs of the noble household. They were the lowest tier of the servant class, but at the same time, they were the next generation of the castle's guardians. Their childhood had no toys, only rags, fire, and manure. Next, we will discuss another corner, filled with female hardship, the laundry room and the sewing room. Dear listeners, we've had a glimpse of the grueling work in the laundry room, but in this chapter, we will focus on the female servants who spent their lives amidst lye, steam, and fine needles. Their work was the foundation for maintaining the noble's outward dignity. Yet they themselves were often seen as the lowest rung of society. Welcome to the laundry and sewing rooms, a women's realm filled with skill, exhaustion, and silent resistance. The laundry room, a double toll on body and health. The work of the laundress and the ironing maid was among the most physically draining in the servant system and the most damaging to health. The stone punishment, washing was not done in comfortable sinks, but on cold stone floors using rough wooden tools. They often worked kneeling or bent over, enduring the irritation of icy water and harsh lye, like wood, ash, and soapwort. This led to high rates of arthritis, rheumatism, and severe skin conditions. The assault of steam and smoke. The ironing room was extremely hot, filled with steam and smoke from the heated metal. Ironing maids had to endure long hours of scorching heat and respiratory irritation. Their hands were frequently burned by the heavy irons, yet they had to maintain extreme focus, as scorching a piece of lace or silk was an unthinkable mistake. The fate of isolation. The laundry room was usually located in a remote corner of the castle, near a water source for dirty water disposal. This geographical isolation limited the laundress's social circle. They mostly interacted with each companions, and their voice carried almost no weight in the castle. The sewing room, eye strain, diligence, and invisible skill. The work of the seamstress, or linen maid, was less physically brute than the laundry room, but it required high professional skill and patience. They were the castle's fabric restoration masters. The art of repair, mending noble clothing, was known as the invisible art. Seamstresses had to use stitches barely visible to the naked eye to repair worn or torn silk, lace, and velvet. If a noble noticed a repair, it was considered an insult to their skill. The housekeeper's right hand, seamstresses often reported directly to the housekeeper and were responsible for managing the valuable linen room. They counted and logged every piece of fabric, ensuring linens weren't lost or chewed by rats. They were an integral part of the housekeeper's wealth management system. Sewing for the future. They didn't just mend old clothes. They also made new daily wear and undergarments for the nobility. They were intimately aware of the noble's body changes and private details, yet had to remain absolutely discreet. 8 specific risks for female servants. Female servants, whether in the kitchen, laundry, or sewing room, faced additional risks that male servants did not. The shackles of morality. The housekeeper placed extremely strict demands on the maid's morality. Any rumor of flirting, misconduct, or inappropriate association could lead to their dismissal. A woman's reputation was far more fragile than a man's. The threat of harassment. Female servants in the castle frequently faced sexual harassment or coercion from noblemen or senior male servants, like the steward or head footman. In that era, a low-ranking maid had almost no means to protect herself, and resistance often led to even graver consequences. The disaster of pregnancy. If a maid became pregnant, it was an almost ruinous disaster. She would be swiftly dismissed, losing her shelter and livelihood. The entire castle system was utterly callous toward the life and fertility of its female staff. Despite this, the laundry and sewing rooms also provided female servants with a rare women's mutual support community. In their labor, they shared their hardships and encouraged one another, forming an invisible network of female support, seeking a bit of human warmth in a difficult environment. Next, we will discuss the castle's security and defense system, examining how the guards, watchmen, and gatekeepers ensured the castle's safety at night and during wartime, and the relationship with the common servants. Dear listeners, we have climbed every step of the servant pyramid, from the well-dressed steward to the armed guards. Now, we will descend to the castle's lowest level to meet the group that is the least visible, yet most indispensable, the odd job men, laborers, and various unnamed bottom-rung servants. Their story is one of pure physical output, never-ending repetition, and a destiny of being completely forgotten by history. The daily life of the laborer, pure physical engines, these lowest-tier servants, had no fine livery or skill allowances. Their sole value was muscle power and endurance. The cellar haulers. The castle required massive logistical support. Laborers were responsible for hauling dozens of barrels of wine, beer, and salted meat from the cellar to the kitchen, and vast amounts of coal and firewood from the stores to every fireplace. Their working environment was often dark, damp, and filled with the smell of mildew and rats. The martyrs of cleanliness, odd job men handled the most repulsive waste in the castle, cleaning chamber pots, clearing rubbish from the ditches, carrying animal carcasses, and the most dreaded task of all, clearing the cesspit. This work was not only unbearably foul, but also extremely dangerous, as the pits were filled with toxic gases and disease. The versatile temp, the odd job man, had no fixed job description. They were the universal tool, going wherever manpower was needed. One moment digging in the garden, the next shoveling manure in the stables, and the next called upon to patch a crack in the castle wall. Their lives were a series of random, dirty, high-intensity manual tasks. Survival at the bottom, speak less, do more. Stay alive at the very bottom of the pyramid. Survival was the only philosophy. No voice. These bottom-rung servants had almost no say. They had no opportunity to meet senior staff, let alone the nobility. If they fell ill or were too tired, they had no right to complain, as they could easily be replaced by new, strong laborers. Meager pay, their wages were the lowest in the servant system, usually just enough to scrape by. They had no expectation of tips or gifts. Getting a piece of relatively clean black bread from the kitchen was considered the small joy of the day. An invisible fate, historical records rarely mention their names or deeds. Their lives and deaths were often quiet and unremarkable, like a stone in the castle that was removed or worn down and quickly forgotten. Adorned. The castle's outsiders, contractors, and day laborers, in addition to the fixed low-tier staff. The castle's operation required a large number of temporary workers and outsourced personnel. Builders and craftsmen, when the castle needed repairs or expansion, temporary carpenters, masons, and plasterers were hired. They usually did not live in the castle but worked outside with their own tools. They were skilled temps with a higher status than odd job men, but still subjected to the supervision and constraints of the senior servants. Seasonal helpers, during harvest, brewing, or large banquets. The castle needed to hire a large number of seasonal helpers. They were often peasants or vagrants from nearby villages. They worked for short periods with low pay, but their presence brought a brief burst of noise and external information to the castle. The servant boundary. There was a clear line between temporary workers and permanent servants. Temporary workers were outside the castle's hierarchy, did not enjoy the stable servant rations, but were also not bound by the castle's strict discipline. They served as a buffer between the world of servitude and the external world. The odd job men and laborers were the unsung heroes of the castle. They took on all the work everyone else avoided, underwriting every piece of aristocratic splendor with their sweat and strength. Their story reminds us that any magnificent structure and luxurious lifestyle is ultimately built upon the most basic, fundamental manual labor. Next, we will focus on the most private aspect of servant life: wages, tips, and the underground economy. Dear listeners, we have climbed every step of the servant pyramid, from the well-dressed steward to the armed guards. Now, we will descend to the castle's lowest level to meet the group that is the least visible, yet most indispensable: the odd job men, laborers, and various unnamed bottom-rung servants. Their story is one of pure physical output, never-ending repetition, and a destiny of being completely forgotten by history. The daily life of the laborer, pure physical engines, these lowest-tier servants had no fine livery or skill allowances. Their sole value was muscle power and endurance. The cellar haulers. The castle required massive logistical support. Laborers were responsible for hauling dozens of barrels of wine, beer, and salted meat from the cellar to the kitchen, and vast amounts of coal and firewood from the stores to every fireplace. Their working environment was often dark, damp, and filled with the smell of mildew and rats. The martyrs of cleanliness. Odd job men handled the most repulsive waste in the castle, cleaning chamber pots, clearing rubbish from the ditches, carrying animal carcasses, and the most dreaded task of all, clearing the cesspit. This work was not only unbearably foul, but also extremely dangerous, as the pits were filled with toxic gases and disease. The versatile temp, the odd job man, had no fixed job description. They were the universal tool, going wherever manpower was needed. One moment digging in the garden, the next shoveling manure in the stables, and the next called upon to patch a crack in the castle wall. Their lives were a series of random, dirty, high-intensity manual tasks. Survival at the bottom, speak less, do more, stay alive at the very bottom of the pyramid. Survival was the only philosophy. No voice. These bottom-rung servants had almost no say. They had no opportunity to meet senior staff, let alone the nobility. If they fell ill or were too tired, they had no right to complain, as they could easily be replaced by new, strong laborers. Meager pay. Their wages were the lowest in the servant system, usually just enough to scrape by. They had no expectation of tips or gifts. Getting a piece of relatively clean black bread from the kitchen was considered the small joy of the day. An invisible fate, historical records rarely mention their names or deeds. Their lives and deaths were often quiet and unremarkable, like a stone in the castle that was removed or worn down, and quickly forgotten. Adorned. The castle's outsiders, contractors and day laborers, in addition to the fixed low-tier staff. The castle's operation required a large number of temporary workers and outsourced personnel, builders and craftsmen. When the castle needed repairs or expansion, temporary carpenters, masons, and plasterers were hired. They usually did not live in the castle, but worked outside with their own tools. They were skilled temps with a higher status than odd job men, but still subjected to the supervision and constraints of the senior servants. Seasonal helpers during harvest, brewing, or large banquets. The castle needed to hire a large number of seasonal helpers. They were often peasants or vagrants from nearby villages. They worked for short periods with low pay, but their presence brought a brief burst of noise and external information to the castle. The servant boundary. There was a clear line between temporary workers and permanent servants. Temporary workers were outside the castle's hierarchy, did not enjoy the stable servant rations, but were also not bound by the castle's strict discipline. They served as a buffer between the world of servitude and the external world. The odd job men and laborers were the unsung heroes of the castle. They took on all the work everyone else avoided, underwriting every piece of aristocratic splendor with their sweat and strength. Their story reminds us that any magnificent structure and luxurious lifestyle is ultimately built upon the most basic, fundamental manual labor. Next, we will focus on the most private aspect of servant life, wages, tips, and the underground economy. Dear listeners, the castle was the domain of the Lord, and the Lord's will was the law. For the castle servants, they lived under a dual legal system, adhering to national or territorial laws, but more stringently, submitting to the noble family's internal system of strict discipline and punishment. Their story is one of fear, obedience, and the difficulty of seeking justice under aristocratic authority. The legal status of servants, from freemen to dependent as employees. The legal status of servants was complex and fragile. Contractual obligation. Most servants were hired through oral or written contracts. These contracts stipulated their duties, wages, and tenure. Once signed, the servant forfeited certain freedoms, especially concerning movement and privacy, and was required to obey the master's commands absolutely. The paradox of family member, although servants were considered part of the household. This family relationship was entirely unequal. They did not possess the rights of a family member, yet bore unconditional responsibilities. In many legal senses, a servant's status bordered on that of property or dependent, their fate entirely in the master's hands. Contempt for the nobility, verbal or behavioral offense by a servant toward a noble, was legally considered more severe than common crime. This was not just insubordination, but a challenge to the social order and hierarchy. potentially leading to extremely harsh punishments, including expulsion or even imprisonment. The castle's punishment system, from verbal warning to corporal punishment. The internal punishment system was executed by the steward or housekeeper, aiming to maintain discipline swiftly and effectively. Common offenses: dereliction of duty and idleness. Most common included negligence in work, tardiness, or failing to complete assigned tasks. Theft and embezzlement, stealing food, wine, or engaging in small-scale corruption like the head cook, were serious infractions. Misconduct, drunkenness, gambling, loud noises in the dormitory, or bringing unauthorized outsiders into the castle. Disciplinary measures, verbal warning and fines. First offenses usually resulted in a verbal warning. More serious violations, such as breaking expensive items, were punished with a deduction of wages. Reduced rations. A common, humiliating punishment was the reduction of food rations, e.g., being given only black bread and water, or being forbidden from drinking beer or wine. Corporal punishment. In the medieval and earlier periods, corporal punishment was not uncommon, especially for the lowest-tier servants and juvenile staff, like kitchen scullions. This could include flogging, particularly after serious crimes like theft. However, with time and the formalization of servant contracts, corporal punishment gradually decreased, but remained a tool of deterrence in private households. Expulsion and banishment for the gravest offenses, such as persistent theft, improper relations with a master's family member, or violent behavior. The punishment was immediate dismissal. An expelled servant not only lost their stable livelihood, but also had their reputation ruined, making it nearly impossible to find work in other noble households. The third, appeals and the illusion of justice within the castle. Servants had the right to appeal, but this channel was often extremely limited. The steward's arbitration, any internal conflict, servant disputes, objections to punishment, was first arbitrated by the steward. The steward acted as both judge and enforcer, and his ruling was generally final. Seeking noble intervention, a servant could appeal directly to the lord or lady, but this was an extremely risky step. If the appeal was successful, they might gain justice or even a promotion. But if the master deemed it trivial or offensive, they would face even graver consequences. This appeal was usually reserved for cases where the servant believed the steward was acting with extreme injustice or corruption. External judiciary. If a servant committed serious crimes like murder or grand theft, they would be handed over to the external territorial court for trial and sentencing. In such cases, the noble family would distance themselves, and the servant would face the judicial process as a common citizen. The iron hand of castle discipline ensured the stable operation of the servant system. Under this strict authority, servants learned prudence, obedience, and the wisdom of survival within their limited freedom. In the next chapter, we will conclude our discussion of the servant system by focusing on the servants' private lives, friendships, and romantic relationships, exploring how they constructed their emotional world within the high walls. Dear listeners, we have meticulously observed the duties, discipline, and survival struggles of the servants. Now, let's turn our attention to the part of them that makes them human, how they loved, how they made friends, and how they found fleeting moments of warmth in a space devoid of privacy. The private life of a servant was the castle's most clandestine and emotionally resistant form of underground activity. Friendship and mutual aid networks. The soft power of survival under the harsh hierarchy and overwhelming work pressure. Friendship was one of the servants' most crucial survival tools. Vents and listeners. The friendships formed between servants were the only vent for releasing work stress. A kitchen boy could complain to a laundress about the cook's temper. A footman could vent to a groom about the lord's ridiculous demands. This listening and understanding was a vital psychological support for them to keep going. The secret of mutual aid. The servant network possessed a strong mutual aid function. A sick servant might receive secretly delivered food and herbs from a friend. A servant needing to run an errand might get cover from another. This underground assistance was invisible, but highly effective. Formation of cliques. Friendships often evolved into cliques. Servants would form groups based on their position: kitchen faction, stable faction, hall faction, or region. These factions would engage in small-scale internal competition when vying for limited resources. Better dormitories, more generous leftovers, and information. I. The compression of private life, survival without privacy for a servant. Private life was a concept compressed to the smallest degree and constantly under threat of intrusion. Zero privacy in dormitories. In the cramped dormitories, servants had no space of their own. They had to sleep and change in front of everyone. This meant they had to learn to be alone in a crowd, deeply hiding their true feelings and thoughts. The surveillance of rest time, a servant's rest time, was strictly monitored. Watchmen and senior staff could patrol at any moment to ensure they were not gambling, drinking, or engaging in any behavior that might compromise work efficiency. True relaxation was impossible. The only moments of solitude, the only brief moments of solitude, a servant might achieve were perhaps a late-night trip to the outhouse alone, or a quick prayer, or moment of contemplation in a secluded castle corner. These brief moments of peace were essential for maintaining their sense of self. Third, romance and love, the high-risk forbidden flower under the castle's power structure and discipline. Romantic relationships were a high-risk forbidden flower. Segregation of male and female staff. Castles typically strictly segregated the living areas and dormitories of male and female servants to prevent immoral conduct. This physical separation made contact between servants charged with tension and anticipation. Secret rendezvous, servants had to plot their meetings like spies. Locations might be a quiet corner of the kitchen late at night, a dark cellar, or within the clipped hedge mazes of the garden. This sense of furtive excitement often deepened their affection. The marriage dilemma, if servants decided to marry, they generally had to leave the castle to find new jobs and accommodation in town. A few senior servants like the head cook or housekeeper might be permitted to marry and continue working in the castle, but their spouse usually had to be a free person outside the castle, i.e., faith and hope, the sanctuary of the soul in such challenging lives. Religious faith became the sanctuary for the souls of many servants. Equality in the church, before God, noble and servant were theoretically equal. In attending church services, servants could find a moment of dignity and peace. A repository of hope, religion offered them the hope of an afterlife, making them believe that the toil and suffering of this life would be rewarded in heaven. This faith was a powerful spiritual motivation for many lower-tier servants to endure and persevere. The emotional world of the servants, though constrained by high walls and discipline, was not extinguished. They used cautious friendships, stolen moments of solitude, and high-risk romance to construct an invisible emotional refuge, ensuring their lives were not merely a collection of labor and obedience. With this, we conclude the core 20 chapters of the castle servant system. We can now integrate the remaining chapters or continue to focus on more specific details. Next, we will discuss an intriguing topic: servant livery, clothing, and appearance, examining how their outward presentation reflected and reinforced the castle's hierarchy. Dear listeners, if you found the noble's attire magnificent, the servant's livery was precise. In the castle, you didn't need words. You only needed to look at what a servant wore and how they were presented to instantly know their exact position in the servant pyramid. Welcome to the skin of hierarchy, the sociology worn on the body of the servant. The philosophy of livery, the master's badge, a servant's livery, especially that of senior staff, was more than just clothing. It was the master's mobile badge. Family colors, many noble families had their own family colors and coat of arms. The servant's livery had to use these colors and feature the family crest, embroidered on buttons, epaulets, or caps. This visually declared, "I am the property and servant of County Duke." So and so. Expensive decorum, the livery made for senior servants in aristocratic households, was typically made of high-quality wool and linen, brightly colored and well-tailored. This was an investment, as the servant's level of decorum directly reflected the master's financial capability and taste. A shabby or dirty uniform was the master's greatest shame. The hand-me-down welfare. Only senior servants were entitled to formal livery. Lower-tier staff, such as odd-job men and kitchen boys, usually wore old, worn-out, or hand-me-down clothes from senior servants. This disparity in attire clearly defined the class boundaries. I. The power of details, buttons, wigs, and shoes, beyond the uniform. Every detail silently spoke of the servant's status. Buttons and material. The buttons on a footman's livery might be made of brass or silver, unlike the coarse fabric buttons of the lower staff. The valet's waistcoat might contain silk elements, while a common footman's was only coarse wool. The symbolism of wigs. In the 18th century, the wig was a status symbol. Senior footmen or valets might be required to wear white or pale-colored wigs to mimic noble fashion. However, these wigs required immense maintenance costs, often handled by the housekeeper or specialized servants. Clean ankles. Footmen were required to wear immaculate white stockings and highly polished leather shoes. Their ankles had to be beyond reproach. This was because the noble's gaze often fell upon their lower legs and feet during service. Even a speck of mud or dirt was considered disrespect to the master. Third, the attire of female servants, practicality, and restraint. The clothing design for female servants emphasized practicality, modesty, and hierarchy. Dress color and material. Maids' dresses were typically made of dark or gray coarse fabric to conceal stains. Only the lady's maid, who served the mistress directly, might wear well-tailored, lighter-colored dresses, and be allowed some fashionable accessories. Aprons and caps. The apron was the most essential piece of workwear for female servants. It not only protected the clothing underneath, but also signified their role in service. Caps or head coverings were mandatory to keep hair tidy and to minimize the temptation of the female staff. The housekeepers' and headmaids' caps were usually more refined and starched. Bans on jewelry and makeup. Servants were generally forbidden from wearing any noticeable jewelry or makeup. Any attempt to transgress the noble status through appearance was strictly prohibited and punished. Ideve. The pressure of appearance maintenance. Maintaining this skin of hierarchy required immense effort and time. Eternal polishing. The first thing a servant did upon waking was to polish their shoes, buttons, and brush the dust from their livery. This was the ritual before presenting themselves to the nobility. Fear of stains. Every servant, especially the footman, lived in fear of stains. A food stain could mean a wage deduction or even dismissal. They had to be as precise and careful as surgeons during service. The servant's livery was the most visual manifestation of the castle's hierarchy. It reminded the servants of their own place and announced to all who entered the castle, "This is an orderly world, governed by rules." Next, we will discuss an interesting topic: castle banquets and entertainment, examining how servants orchestrated an equally complex performance behind the scenes, while the nobility indulged in pleasure. Dear listeners, when the Lord announced, "There is a banquet tonight," the nobles heard music, wine, and laughter. The servants heard 24 hours of hell. The castle banquet was the ultimate test for every part of the servant pyramid, the moment when stress and chaos peaked. Welcome to Behind the Curtain of Revelry, a challenge far more complex than the performance in the foreground. Banquet preparation. The war against time. From the moment the banquet was announced, the castle went into a state of military preparation. The cook's nightmare. The head cook had to plan dozens, perhaps 100 dishes in a very short time, utilizing all available kitchen staff. Stoves had to run at overcapacity, and ingredients needed to be constantly ferried in. The cook was now the battlefield commander, where a delay of even a second for a single dish could ignite a burst of fury. The housekeeper's stress. The housekeeper was responsible for preparing all tableware, linens, and decorations. She had to ensure every piece of lace tablecloth was perfect, and every piece of silverware gleamed. Before the banquet, she would conduct a carpet-style inspection of her maids and seamstresses to prevent any minor error. The steward's budget. The steward had to keep a clear head during the banquet, tracking the consumption of every bottle of wine and every cut of meat, ensuring that the nobility's pleasure did not lead to the family's financial collapse. He faced dual pressure from the lord and the suppliers. Service. The art of precision and invisibility. Banquet service was the highest expression of the art of precision and invisibility for footmen and pages. Walking tables. Footmen had to memorize the status, preferences, and seating of every guest. They had to move silently, quickly, and accurately through the noisy music and chatter, delivering food and drink to the designated guest without spilling or making any noise. The risk of light and fire. The banquet hall was usually lit by countless candles, oil lamps, and fireplaces. Footmen had to be extremely careful while moving quickly to avoid knocking over fire sources. Under candlelight, the servants' livery and movements needed to be flawless to enhance the luxurious atmosphere. Noble fastidiousness. Noble guests often became more demanding at banquets. They might deliberately challenge servants to show off their own status. Servants had to learn to swallow insults and respond to everything with a calm and polite demeanor. Behind the entertainment, musicians and theatrical servants' castle entertainment, such as balls, plays, or concerts, was also provided by specialized servants or hired personnel. The musician's dual identity. The castle might employ resident musicians. They were servants yet held the status of artists. They had to be entertaining while working, but during rest, they were bound by castle discipline just like any other servant. The midnight cleanup, when the nobles retired with their hangovers after the ball. The servant's nightmare was just beginning. Kitchen boys had to wash mountains of dishes. Footmen had to clear debris, candle wax and stains. Watchmen had to ensure no fire hazards were left from the revelry. Post-banquet perks and chaos after the banquet, servants received unique perks, often accompanied by chaos. The scramble for leftovers, the food scraps left on the banquet tables, were a rare feast for the lower-tier servants. Often, the steward or head cook would preside over a leftover distribution ceremony, which was frequently accompanied by scrambling and chaos among the lowest staff. The tip surge, tips left by guests during the banquet, multiplied several times over, greatly boosting the servants' morale. However, this was also a source of jealousy and conflict among the staff. The castle banquet was a perfect noble performance, but its success relied entirely on the beyond-limit pressure and cooperation endured by the servants behind the scenes. It was their hardest, most dangerous, yet most validating moment. Next, we will discuss a key external group in the servant system, suppliers and craftsmen, the bridge between the castle and the outside world. Dear listeners, the daily operation of a castle was not a completely closed loop. It required a constant supply of goods and specialized skills. Outside the castle walls were a group of equally important figures: vendors, artisans, and day laborers. Their story is one of trade, trust, and power, the castle's absolute reliance on the outside world. Vendors, the castle's supply officers, and the cook's counterpart vendors were the lifeline of the castle's supplies, and their role involved complex interests with senior servants, especially the steward and the head cook. Contract and trust. The castle typically signed long-term supply contracts with reliable vendors. These vendors supplied wine, spices, refined sugar, and luxury goods from distant places. This long-term relationship was built on trust, but also left room for corruption. The cook's power play. The head cook had the final say over the quality and quantity of ingredients. This gave him immense power in negotiations with vendors. Vendors might bribe the cook, e.g., providing free personal items in exchange for stable orders and inflated prices. The cook gained substantial gray income from these kickbacks. The steward's oversight. The steward was responsible for overseeing all accounts to prevent the cook or purchasing staff from colluding with vendors. This triangular relationship, steward, cook, vendor, was filled with tension and suspicion. Vendors had to skillfully balance the relationships between these three parties. Artisans, the outsourcing of specialized skills. The castle required various specialized skills to maintain its architecture, mechanics, and noble goods, which often needed to be hired externally. Resident versus temporary. A few key artisans, such as the blacksmith or the farrier, might have a workshop near the castle, providing resident services. More specialized craftsmen, such like glaziers, goldsmiths, or architects, required temporary hire. Artisan status. Artisans generally held a higher social status than lower-tier servants. Because they possessed scarce specialized knowledge, they were freemen, owning their own workshops and tools, and were not bound by the castle's strict discipline. However, when working inside the castle, they still had to abide by the rules set by the steward. Castle apprentices. Some castles might hire apprentices to learn specific trades, such as tailoring or shoemaking. These apprentices were both servants of the castle and students of the artisans, occupying an ambiguous space between servitude and free craftsmanship. Third, external services and day laborers, the supplementary force during busy times during specific periods. The castle's servant staff was insufficient and had to rely on external day laborers and temporary services. Seasonal labor during busy seasons, harvest, brewing, or large-scale construction. The steward would hire day laborers from nearby villages. They were paid daily and were only responsible for the heaviest manual tasks, such as hauling and digging. External messengers and intelligence. Messengers were a vital channel connecting the castle to outside information. They not only delivered letters but were also carriers of various gossip and external intelligence. The porter was the first person they encountered, thus becoming a key node for information exchange between the inside and outside of the castle. Stable dependents. The maintenance of the castle's horses and carriage fleet required grooms and coachmen. However, the maintenance of large carriages or valuable horses might require reliance on professional veterinarians, external experts for whom the castle had to pay high fees. The group of vendors and artisans collectively formed the external support system of the castle. They brought the necessary supplies, skills, and information for the castle's operation. The servants' interactions with these outsiders provided them with a faint hope of overhearing news of the outside world, or even escaping castle life. Next, we will return to the inner world of the servants to discuss servant ambition and the path to promotion, examining how a lower-tier servant could climb the pyramid through effort, intelligence, or luck. Dear listeners, we have described the castle servant system as a rigid pyramid. But even the lowest-tier servants harbored a secret desire for promotion. For them, advancement meant not just higher wages, but dignity, authority, and control over their own destiny. Welcome to the world of servant ambition, a fierce competition of wisdom, effort, and luck. The foundation of promotion, effort, and learning. All advancement had to be built upon a foundation of excellent job performance. Mastery of skills. A servant had to be proficient in their trade. A kitchen boy needed to master perfect chopping and seasoning. A maid needed expertise in complex garment care and mending. A footman needed impeccable mastery of table, etiquette, and memory for names. In the castle, skill was hard currency. Loyalty and obedience. Absolute loyalty to the master and senior staff was a prerequisite for promotion. A servant had to appear reliable and never betray the master's secrets. In the castle, loyalty was sometimes more important than skill, as it concerned the master's reputation and privacy. Endurance and longevity. Many senior positions required a servant to have many years of service experience. A young servant had to endure years of low pay, high-intensity work, and humiliation, waiting for the frail predecessors to depart. In a sense, the path to promotion was a seniority game. The wisdom of climbing the pyramid. Socializing in factions, mere hard work, was far from enough. Servants needed superb emotional intelligence and social cunning to climb upward, currying favor with senior staff. A servant's fate rested in the hands of their direct superiors, the steward, housekeeper, and head cook. Aspiring servants had to learn to choose sides and curry favor with these senior staff. This might involve small bribes, like offering the cook a fine bottle of wine, or providing them with extra help in their duties. The art of not being seen. The most senior servants mastered the art of perfect service without being noticed. They could anticipate the master's every need and complete tasks before the master even spoke. This foresight was a sign of emotional intelligence and crucial for promotion to valet or lady's maid. The power of information. The information a servant held was their biggest bargaining chip. A servant who knew the master's secrets or the corruption of other staff could use this information to protect themselves, gain favor, or eliminate rivals. But using information was high risk. If exposed, it could lead to ruin. Luck and accident. The turning points of fate on the servant's path to promotion. Luck often played a more decisive role than effort. Crucial openings. The vacancy of a senior position, such as the death of an old steward, was a once-in-a-decade opportunity for a low-tier servant. Who seized the chance often depended on who was most trusted by the steward at that time. The master's favor. A servant might gain the lord's direct appreciation due to an accidental, exceptional act of service. For example, saving the master's life during an emergency or successfully handling a delicate diplomatic embarrassment. This leaping promotion could skip a servant over multiple ranks. Marrying up or out, for female servants, the best form of promotion was to marry a free man such as a wealthy merchant or artisan, thereby leaving the servitude class entirely. For male servants, marrying a property-owning widow could also bring a massive change in fortune. The road from kitchen boy to steward was the result of countless small choices, endless endurance, and continuous fierce competition. Success stories were few, but these beacons of hope were what kept the entire servant system operating. Next, we will discuss a grand and unavoidable topic: servant retirement and old age, examining where a servant's life went when they were too old and frail to work. Dear listeners, a servant's life was a process of burning oneself out for the noble family. When physical strength waned and old age arrived, they had to face a harsh reality. The castle was a place for the young. The word pension was rarely found in the noble's vocabulary. Welcome to the twilight of the servant, a story of dedication, abandonment, and destitution in old age. The harsh reality: no pension in the castle in the medieval and early modern periods. Servants had no modern retirement system. Termination of contract. Servant contracts were typically based on the servant's ability to serve. Once a servant could no longer fulfill the contract duties due to old age, illness, or disability, the master had the right to terminate the contract. This dismissal was often swift and ruthless. The master's charity. A servant's retirement treatment depended entirely on the master's goodwill and generosity, not on their right. A benevolent lord might allow old servants who had served the family their entire lives to continue living in the castle, giving them minimal food rations and assigning them easy jobs, like gatekeeping or storeroom watching. But this was charity, which could be withdrawn at any time. The privilege of senior staff. Only a tiny fraction of senior servants, such as the steward or head housekeeper, managed to accumulate enough wealth from years of high wages to buy a small house in town and live out their old age in comfort. For the majority of manual laborers, this was a distant dream. Survival strategies for old servants. Dependence and alms for the old servants dismissed from the castle. Survival became a new struggle. Dependence on relatives. Many old servants had to return to their birthplace or hometown and depend on their siblings or married children. They became a burden on the family, bringing with them only illness and meager savings. This is why younger servants worked hard to save money to send home, hoping it would buy them care in their old age. Serving as caretakers. Some old servants who still had some strength might find an easy but low-paying job on the periphery of the noble estate, such as acting as a doorman or guide outside the manor gates. They traded their remaining experience and decorum for a slim chance of survival. The final descent for those with no savings and no relatives to rely on. The final fate was often to become a beggar. They would sit outside town churches or in the market, relying on the alms of strangers. This stood in cruel contrast to the opulence in which they had spent their youth. Family, memory, and the status of the elder servant. Despite their tragic fate, some long-serving elder servants still maintained a special informal status within the castle. Living history books. Old servants were the family's living history books. They knew stories of the lord's childhood, family secrets, and the habits of every generation. Younger servants, and even the noble's younger generation, sometimes consulted them for family traditions and rules. Wisdom and consultation. A retired housekeeper, even if no longer responsible for daily management, might be treated as a consultant. Her experience was invaluable to newly appointed junior staff, who might secretly offer her gifts in exchange for guidance. The tragedy of status. This informal status, while affording a little respect, did not provide material security. The old servants still lived off the master's charity. Their life proved how fragile dedication to the noble household was in the face of utility. The twilight of the servant was the most somber scene in the entire castle system. It starkly revealed the essence of the aristocratic system. Only lives that provided value were needed. Once that value was exhausted, they were ruthlessly discarded. We have now completed a comprehensive analysis of the castle servant pyramid. In the next chapter, we will take a lighthearted approach to inventory the most famous or unique servants who actually existed in history. providing an interesting and human conclusion to this serious historical journey. Dear listeners, we have discussed the roles of the steward and head cook in general terms. Now, let's turn the spotlight onto those servants who genuinely left their names behind. They were either fiercely loyal, exceptionally intelligent, or had unique fates, becoming the shadow heroes in historical documents. Welcome to the Shadows of History, an inventory of the most unique and famous castle servants. Legendary stewards. The peak of loyalty and power, the most famous servants in history were often those high-ranking stewards and housekeepers who wielded immense power. Benjamin Franklin's servant, William Strahan, while not a castle servant, he was an eminent steward and private secretary who served various English nobles. These senior servants managed not only household affairs, but also participated in their master's political business and intelligence activities, their influence far exceeding the title of servant. They were the noble's extended arm in the commercial and political world. The steward's wisdom, in many novels and historical records, an astute, upright, and capable steward was the guarantee of the family's wealth. They often understood better than their master how to manage money and avoid debt. Their names might not be known to the public, but within noble circles, the reputation of a good steward was more valuable than any title. History-changing personal servants, secrets and influence valets and ladies' maids, due to their proximity to the master, were often inadvertently drawn into historical events, or even influenced decision-making. Dressing for power. The personal valets of many important politicians and monarchs in history were not only responsible for daily care, but also acted as private secretaries, confidants, and political advisors. For example, the personal valets of King Louis XIV of France could influence the king's mood and daily schedule, thereby indirectly affecting state affairs. The maid's whisper. The lady's maid was a treasure trove of secrets. They knew all the mistress's private affairs, social gossip, and true opinions on political figures. Through these whispers, they could subtly influence the mistress's mood and judgment, even transmitting or intercepting information in aristocratic social circles. They were the most effective intelligence network in the castle. Servants of unique skills, prodigies, and talents. Some servants gained fame due to their extraordinary skills or unique talents. The royal head cooks, especially those serving kings or regents, were often the pinnacle figures of culinary art of their time. For example, Taillevent, who served King Charles V of France, whose cookbook was a landmark at the time. The status of these chefs transcended servitude, becoming a form of master artist. The professional runner, in times of poor communication. Some servants were professional express messengers, delivering urgent information between castles at astonishing speeds. Their stamina and speed were, in some ways, more reliable than sending messages by horseback. Servants, with unique fates. From slavery to freedom, most remarkable were the servants who transformed their destiny through service. Emancipated servants, in certain historical periods, some nobles employed freed slaves or non-European servants. Through their service in noble households, they gained education and higher social standing, sometimes even becoming the master's personal assistant, thus achieving a leap in social status. Servant turned artist. Some servants initially worked grinding ink, cleaning studios, or running errands for the master. In the process, they were exposed to art and literature, and through self-study or the master's patronage, they eventually became artists, writers, or scholars. Their success stories were the most inspiring chapters in the servant pyramid. These human stories tell us that while the servant system was rigidly hierarchical and suppressive of human nature, the people living and working within it still maintained their intelligence, individuality, and resistance against fate. Next, we will discuss, from a more modern perspective, the impact of the servant system on modern society and culture, such as etiquette, the service industry, and the butler complex in popular culture. Dear listeners, while the ancient castle servant system has vanished, its legacy is pervasive. From the service standards of high-end hotels to the television shows we watch today, and even our definition of perfect service, all are deeply rooted in the hierarchy and sense of ritual of the castle era. Welcome to Modern Echoes, exploring how the servant system has shaped today's world. The cornerstone of the service industry, from servant to professional fundamental principles and professional ethics of the modern service industry are derived from the training of castle servants. The philosophy of invisible service. The highest state of the castle footmen was invisible service, appearing when the master needed them and disappearing when they did not. This philosophy is adopted by today's high-end hotels, private assistants, and butler services. The modern service industry emphasizes anticipating and meeting client needs without intrusion. The legacy of professional etiquette. The castle servant's mastery of table etiquette, clothing maintenance, and social norms forms the core of modern etiquette education. How to pour wine for a guest, how to fold a napkin, or how to properly introduce visitors. All are inherited from the strict training of the steward and housekeeper. Professionalization, modern private butler training, even involves studying ancient servant duty lists, transforming the three great servant virtues of efficiency, loyalty, and secrecy into modern professional standards. Cultural heritage, the butler complex, and popular culture. The servant class plays a perennial and important role in film, literature, and television, forming a unique butler complex. The charm of literature and screen, from Downton Abbey to The Remains of the Day and the loyal servants in the Sherlock Holmes series. The servant character has always been a focal point for dramatic conflict and moral dilemma. They are carriers of class contradictions and symbols of loyalty, forbearance, and wisdom. The butler's moral authority in popular culture. Senior servants, like the steward, are often imbued with a moral authority that transcends class. They are worldly wise, privy to every family secret, and serve as the conscience of the castle. This image stems from the historical senior servant's actual influence and information control over the master's family. The longing for perfection, modern fascination with the butler, also reflects a yearning for perfect order and absolute decorum. In the fast-paced, chaotic modern life, the image of a servant who can manage everything flawlessly offers a form of psychological solace. The third, linguistic and customary remnants. Many languages and habits we take for granted today originated from or are related to the servant class. The rule of knocking. Servants had to knock before entering a noble's room to ensure they didn't intrude on the master's privacy, though the servants had none themselves. This respect for others' space is a direct reflection of castle etiquette. Evolution of titles. Many modern job titles, such as manager, secretary, and the doorman or porter in hotels, trace their etymology or duties back to the castle's steward, scribe servants, and gatekeeper. IDV. Historical reflection, re-evaluating class, the study of and interest in the history of the servant system, compel us to reflect more deeply on today's social class and labor relations. The value of informal labor. The servant stories remind us of how historically large amounts of informal labor were systematically undervalued and exploited. This encourages us to focus on the rights of workers in low-wage service sectors in modern society, such as domestic helpers and caregivers. Privacy and power. The servant's lack of privacy reflects the nature of power asymmetry. This prompts us to consider issues of personal privacy and surveillance between employers and employees. And in the age of big data, castle servants may belong to the past, but their legacy influences every aspect of our lives today. They were the unsung heroes of ancient societal operation and the foundation of modern service and cultural models. In the following chapters, we will discuss the decline and eventual dissolution of the servant system from a broader perspective. Dear listeners, no system is eternal. We have spent a great deal of time depicting the solidity of the servant pyramid, but now that pyramid begins to crumble. From the late 18th to the early 20th century, a series of major historical events, particularly the Industrial Revolution, 2 world wars, and the rise of social democracy, dealt a fatal blow to the servant system. Welcome to the twilight of the system, exploring how the servant system disintegrated under the impact of modernity. The shock of the Industrial Revolution, technological liberation, and increased choice. The Industrial Revolution was the fundamental driving force behind the collapse of the servant system. Technological substitution. Machines began to replace some servant functions. Gas lamps and later electric lights replaced lamplighters and candle lighting footmen. Plumbing and flush toilets replaced water, carrying servants and chamber pot maids, vacuum cleaners and washing machines greatly reduced the manual labor of the lower staff. Technological development meant the nobility no longer needed a massive army of manual labor. Shift in economic opportunity. Factories and mines in industrialized cities offered new, paid employment opportunities. Although factory work was still arduous, it offered freedom. Servants could earn higher wages and enjoy more personal liberty and privacy, rather than being confined by the strict discipline of the castle. This competition in the labor market made it difficult for castles to recruit and retain lower-tier servants. Increased social mobility. Industrial society fractured traditional class boundaries. A factory owner's wealth could exceed that of a noble. This wealth fluidity began to dismantle the foundation of fixed social status upon which the servant system relied. The World Wars, accelerators of dramatic change. The two world wars were the most lethal accelerators for the servant system. Labor shortages sent vast numbers of male servants to the front lines. During the war, female servants also left the castles for work in munitions factories and medical facilities. Post-war, they discovered new career paths with greater dignity and financial reward, unwilling to return to the oppressive life of servitude. Noble financial exhaustion. The enormous costs of the wars and post-war economic depression quickly depleted the wealth of many noble families. They were forced to sell ancestral lands, close off wings of the castle, or outright dismiss their servant staff. Maintaining a large servant retinue became economically unsustainable. Shifts in social perception. War led to the rise of egalitarian thought. Noble and servant bled the same blood in the trenches and shared the same fate. Post-war society had a much lower tolerance for social service and the privileged class, and reliance on servants was seen as an outdated, unequal form of exploitation. In modern democracy and the rise of servant rights with societal progress, the protection of servant rights also began to emerge. Universal education, widespread education, meant that the children of servants were no longer illiterate. They could choose more respectable careers instead of inheriting their parents' entry into servitude. Legal protections. The emergence of labor laws and social welfare systems began to restrict employers' excessive hours and arbitrary punishment of servants. While these laws were slow to penetrate the domestic service sphere, they provided servants with a legal recourse to uphold their dignity and rights. The servant system did not vanish overnight. It began to disintegrate from the bottom up. The hardest working, dirtiest odd job men were the first to leave. Then came the mid-tier maids and footmen. Eventually, only a few of the most senior servants remained, continuing to provide highly specialized services to shrinking noble households. In the next chapter, we will offer a grand conclusion to reflect on the historical significance of the entire servant system and the ultimate lessons we can learn about human society, hierarchy, and dignity. Dear listeners, we have traversed every corner of the castle servant pyramid, witnessing its rise, rules, suffering, and eventual decline. Now, standing at the conclusion of history, let us summarize what this centuries-long system has truly left behind. Welcome to the eternal lesson, the final reflection on the castle servant system. The servant system's historical contribution, founder of social order. Despite the cruelty of class oppression within the servant system, it made structural contributions to societal development. The origin of management, the highly organized household management systems established by the steward, housekeeper, and head cook are early models for modern corporate management, logistics, and budget control. Their pursuit of efficiency, division of labor, and accountability reflects early managerial thought. Carrier of etiquette and culture, servants were the practical executors and transmitters of aristocratic culture and etiquette. They passed complex social rules, table manners, and dress codes from the noble class to the middle and upper strata of society, shaping the definition of proper and civilized in the Western world. Proof of human resilience in environments of extreme pressure and lack of privacy. Servants still developed strong communities, mutual aid, and emotional support networks. Their stories are powerful proof of the human capacity for emotional resilience, professionalism, and survival wisdom in the face of adversity. The ultimate reflection on hierarchy. The servant pyramid reveals the nature of hierarchy and power in human society in the most stark manner. Asymmetry of power. The servant's fate was entirely dependent on the master's goodwill, revealing how fragile human rights and dignity are in relationships marked by power imbalance. Servants sold not only their labor, but also their time, privacy, and autonomy. Class worn on the body. From the steward's fine livery to the odd job man's coarse rags, the servant's attire was a direct visualization of social status. The demise of this system symbolizes the move of modern society, at least superficially, toward one that values individual merit over birthright. The value of the invisible. The servant's stories remind us that any grand achievement or luxurious life is built upon a vast foundation of overlooked, low status, and unnamed labor. Historical records often focus only on the rulers, but what we have focused on today are the people who supported history yet were forgotten by it. The third, lessons for modernity, redefining service and dignity. The history of servitude offers profound insights into how we view the service industry and human dignity today. Redefining service. The modern service industry inherits the servant's professionalism and dedication, but discards subservience and hierarchical dependency. Service today is based on a relationship of equality and professional contract, not on status dependence. A call for respect and empathy. The hardship of the servants reminds us that all labor, regardless of profession, deserves respect. Knowledge of servant history can foster empathy and respect for today's workers in the service sector. We started with the steward's account books, passed through the greasy, fiery kitchen, walked through the damp, cold laundry room, climbed the guard-patrolled battlements, and finally stand in the twilight of the castle. The castle's servants were the silent majority of history. With their hands and sweat, they built and maintained a world that was grand, magnificent, yet filled with oppression. Their stories are not about princes and princesses, but about real people, striving to find meaning, love, and that irreplaceable human dignity under a rigorous system. Thank you for listening. This bedtime story about the world of castle servants concludes here. Good night, my friends. May your dreams be free of class and filled only with peace and liberty.